Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be listening and watching. I am Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, and welcome to the Foundation's webinar this morning. We have an excellent panel. Those familiar with the Foundation and our Friends of Ukraine network and past webinars surely know today's panelists. John Herbst, former ambassador to Ukraine from the United States and head of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. General Phil Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Deborah Kagan, who's held numerous critical positions at State and Defense Departments. Ian Brzezinski, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO. Kurt Volker, among other positions, and certainly relevant to today, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO. Well, Friday, July 28th, the morning after the presidential debate. Our subject today, G-7, Ukraine Peace Conference, and the upcoming NATO Summit, whereas Ukraine didn't include anything about the debate, but Ukraine and NATO were mentioned last night. Not extensively, but mentioned amid many misstatements of facts and numbers that people had never heard of before during the debate. Certainly, former President Trump repeated the inaccurate charge about the billions of dollars, quote, going to Ukraine. And President Biden pointed out that most of the money is spent here in the United States. President Biden called Putin a war criminal. Trump said Putin's proposal to end the war was unacceptable. He also said Putin would not have invaded Ukraine had he been in office, not mentioning that Russia was already in Crimea and Donbass when he came to office and was still there when he left office. And Trump said, if elected, he would end this war before he was actually sworn in. Our panelists might find some of this relevant to our discussion today, but let's get started. Kurt, let's turn to you first. You've recently returned from Europe, and among other stops, you were at the, I hadn't mentioned this earlier, you were at the Black Sea Conference in Odessa, which didn't get much attention here, but all your other stops and all your other contacts, what's your sense of where we are with all this?
Well, it's a big question, Rob, and thank you for having me. I'm happy to wade in on a couple things. Let me just start with that Odessa conference because, as you say, it hasn't gotten a lot of attention here. This was the first annual Black Sea Security Forum. It was organized to be held in Odessa. It's the first major international conference that's taken place in Odessa since February of 22. We did have a good cross-section of Americans, Europeans, diplomats, military, parliamentarians, and so forth. And it's really remarkable what Ukraine has been able to do in southwestern Ukraine. They have pushed the Russian Navy back. They have opened up the port of Odessa, so it's functioning at 100% of pre-war levels. There have been zero attacks on international shipping as this has gone on. And this is a key economic lifeline for Ukraine. This is how goods are able to be shipped from all over Ukraine out through these ports and to the world, feeding the world with grain and other foodstuffs, but then also other types of goods that are going in and out of Ukraine now. This is critically important. While there, you still have air raid alerts several times throughout the day. That's because the Ukrainians don't know exactly what the target is until it's much closer. So they put an air raid alert over a wide area. But Russia is still firing missiles and drones at Odessa, at Ukrainian civilians, at Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, at energy facilities all over Ukraine, including Odessa and Western Ukraine, Lviv, and so forth. So that is still going on. And it is an indicator that there is more the West can and should do to help protect Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, and particularly this vital economic lifeline for Ukraine, both in terms of providing equipment, but then also in terms of extending air defense coverage from adjoining NATO territory. And I did go to the Romanian border, the town of Ismail in southwestern Ukraine, and it is very close. It's an easy drive, and it is entirely doable to extend air defense coverage over this area. So that's the wrap on the Odessa conference. What I'd like to say more generally before we turn the discussion elsewhere, Ukraine defeating Putinism is a vital interest of the U.S. and Europe. Our objective here should be to prevent a wider war that engulfs all of Europe, engulfs the United States in fighting a global war. We need to prevent that. And if Putinism succeeds in Ukraine, it will move on to the next stop, and we will be facing that wider war. So it is in our vital interest to prevent that. This is why NATO was created, to prevent a World War III in Europe. NATO did a great job of that concerning Western Europe, but we now face the risk of that very same wider war, World War III, growing in Europe unless this is stopped. So this is a vital interest. Point two is we have no plan for Ukrainian victory. As much as we now have President Biden on the record and Tony Blinken on the record saying we want to see Ukraine win this war, there is no plan to do so. And in fact, we continue to hold back on types of equipment and on the use of equipment and on the volume of equipment and the speed of delivery of equipment that we are providing to Ukraine, which indicates a lack of resolve in helping Ukraine win the war rather than a full plan and commitment to doing so. And thirdly, I am deeply concerned that we will not have a strategy for Ukraine winning the war for at least the rest of this year. And I think what we saw from the presidential debate last night confirms that we are not adopting a win the war mentality and putting together the plan and the resources to achieve that right now. If we were in that mindset, we would have used the Ukraine Recovery Conference differently. We would have gone after the full 300 billion of frozen Russian assets, not create a fund of only 50 billion. That is a loan. We would have taken an active part in this peace conference that the Swiss organized. Many other states participated at a head of state level. We were not able to do that. And we would take a much more active role in leading NATO and creating the process by which Ukraine gets an invitation to join membership, to join the alliance at this Washington summit. And that is also not going to happen. So this is a series of missed opportunities this summer. And it is because we do not have such a plan for victory at the moment, but we need one. I'll pause there.
Well, thank you, Kurt. You covered a lot of ground there. Phil, you've been in Europe recently too, going for several capitals. What is your take on where we are, based on your conversations as well as the G7 and the peace conference and the upcoming NATO? What should come out of that?
Well, Bob and team, thanks for having me on with you. This is a great group, and I appreciate being among them. As you occasionally hear in testimony in Congress, let me join and associate myself with all of Ambassador Volker's remarks. Could not have been said better. And I think that his 3 points are incredibly important to conversations now through this election so that we can understand what is our policy and actually articulate a plan for that policy. So my recent travels are not going to surprise you what I heard. NATO is split, but it's not as split as it was the last year that I did so much traveling in Europe. I would say that the new NATO nations and now some of the old NATO nations are very much aligning with a movement to get a plan for Ukraine to come aboard. As you all know, much of old Europe still, but I would call it old Europe minus, are very much against bringing Ukraine in. I heard something yesterday from my beloved NATO. I was a part of it for most of my adult life. And I heard one of the speakers in talking about the possibilities of Ukraine coming aboard. They talked about it's not likely that Ukraine will come aboard with as long as there's a border dispute going on in their nation. And I nearly fell out of my chair to hear anyone in NATO describe what's going on in Ukraine as a border dispute. This is a world superpower that has amassed its army, marched across an internationally recognized border, and is attempting to subjugate its neighbor. We will never get to the recommendations we need if we categorize that as a border dispute. And so getting our minds right and getting our policy right, I would say are very important. May I say that as I talk to nations in Europe, and the last time I was there, I visited 4 nations just several weeks ago, and a common theme is we don't see a strong push from the United States for what we need to do for Ukraine. And until United States takes a position and begins to bring its influence and pressures to bear, it's unlikely that we'll see that dynamic change much in Europe. And so I would advocate for U.S. leadership. I want to just make a quick remark before I give it over to more intelligent people about this thing we're hearing called a bridge. I don't want to be critical or too critical, but I liken the language that we're hearing coming out on Ukraine to what I've heard for decades about Georgia. Every year, we come up with a new set of words to describe our relationship with Georgia. And I don't want to go through a dramatic set of those words, but every year it's a new set of adjectives, but we really don't move the ball. And I feel that we are at risk in the Washington Summit of adjectives, but no substance. And so I think that we need to try to work with our leaders and try to tell our leaders what we really expect is what we want. I'm hearing a couple of things. First, a facility at a U.S. base. I bet it's Ramstein. And that facility would become the new center of focus on Ukraine. This is not a bad thing. I get it. This is a great thing, but this is not really advancing the ball for making Ukraine a part of NATO. Already some people in NATO are objecting to the thought of a Ukraine mission to NATO, like we've had missions to NATO in other areas. And they want a different word used and not use that because it seems to be too strong. And I hear much about the bridge possibly moving the sort of support structure process to the Europeans away from the U.S. I personally would be against that. I think the U.S. needs to lead here. And part of our leadership is Lloyd Austin, our secretary, has done a good job in pulling together support structures. And for him to step aside from that, I think would be a mistake. I'm going to close with a short refrain you have heard from me over and over. Repetition is good for fighter pilots and infantry officers. So here we go again. I believe we need new policy. I believe that policy needs to be publicly acknowledged and it needs to be declaratory. And I think that policy needs to say what we're all about. We all heard John Kirby the other day say that we're giving Ukraine everything they need to win. I love John. He used to work for me. That is not correct. That is factually incorrect. And I can make that argument and go down the 1 inches and work that through. But we need to say something and then make it stick and have a policy that makes it stick. Sorry for getting on my soapbox.
Well, I always like it when you get on your soapbox. I like your soapbox. We've got a lot of stuff on the table. Deborah, I know you're there with John. Some thoughts on what's been said, and you always have very interesting additions to bring into any conversation. Deborah?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm not going to go into sort of gory detail. I think to go along with what General Breedlove said, I think the issue is that the White House eventually gets around to doing the right thing, but it's eventually gets around to. It's sort of like a really it's sort of, they're moving at the pace of a glacier, not during global warming. So and that's a difficult pace when someone's trying to fight and win a war. There are changes being made, but again, they're baby steps. So the latest one is working out an agreement to let U.S. contractors go in the country to sort of work on maintenance and the like. This is something we have proposed to the White House since last December, and it's not, I think, going to be very detailed. I think it's going to have a lot of constrictions on movement and the like. But I will tell you, there's other allies who already have boots on the ground there and are doing this, and they're allowed more freedom of movement by their countries. And there's other allies who are very clear that they do not have the red lines that the United States and Germany and a couple other countries have. And that's good news. And I think the US should take their lead from them. On the comments of turning over the Ukraine contact group to NATO, that's already a done deal, unfortunately. I agree with General Breedlove. We should have kept US leadership there at its core because there are a number of countries who wish not to be involved, and it was convenient to go through third-party cutouts. They're involved, but they just didn't want the attention. I don't know if that is going to be harder under NATO rubric than it has been. And the other issue is, from a Ukraine perspective, does this mean that someone like Hungary could block the shipment of arms if it's a NATO decision? I think commitments have been given to the Ukrainians that, and General Breedlove knows this very well because I saw him do this in his career as SACEUR/EUCOM, that General Cavoli will then switch to his EUCOM hat as opposed to being SACEUR to make that go on. I think that's sort of their version of a fail-safe. I also think they were looking for something that was not really very fulsome to announce at the summit. So they can announce that at the summit without doing much else because it's already up and running, and now it's just going to be NATO as opposed to the United States. I think that these are basically thin gruel. I think these are ways to offer Ukraine something that looks good on paper, but in practical application does not fill the bill. I do have a couple of concerns. Going back to what Kurt said, I think part of the problem that we're not facing up to isn't just that the speed with which the equipment that's being announced isn't getting there. There are also serious supply line problems, both in this country and among West European defense industrial producers. And their supply lines are not moving at light speed. Some of this is they're not being forced to, and some of this is getting spare parts and filling up those supply lines with the right workers and the like has taken an inordinate period of time. Not to be unexpected, but you would think that their governments would have put them more on a wartime footing by now, and that has not happened. So even though President Biden has issued edicts about speeding up defense production, it is still not on a wartime footing, and the processes within the Pentagon are incredibly slow in getting that stuff done, and unreasonably slow from my perspective. So these every 2 weeks announcements on presidential drawdown are great. But I think if you sort of scratch the surface of those, maybe 50% or more are not being delivered anytime soon, some as far out as a year or two. And so it's a great announcement and it looks good on paper, but not a lot of it is flowing very rapidly to Ukraine. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then the last point I'll raise is I think the United States really needs to step in a major way to ensure that the F-16 training goes forward. I think Europe has done a great job on this. I think they've done an excellent job, but they have, as General Breedlove knows, they have a capacity problem. They're switching over to F-35s. They don't have multiple air bases to do multiple kinds of training. So I think the US has to step up and offer training slots to Ukraine for F-16 training in this country. And you're going to keep hearing that it's a language capability issue, but the Ukrainians are training very rapidly on learning English language training. That's going on not only in the UK, but in Lakeland, Texas. So I think it's time to just make a point very clearly to the Russians and others that the Ukraine is not going to be constrained by lack of training billets for F-16 pilots. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I've always wondered about training pilots in English in Texas, but I'll leave that alone. Ian, you've been outspoken about NATO and how more can be done to extend to Ukraine. What are your comments as we head into this, with whatever's been said, but also as we lead into the NATO summit?
Thanks, Bob. It's a real privilege to be here with General Breedlove, Ambassador Volker, Pastor Herbst, and our colleagues here. Let me focus on the NATO summit. And Deborah, I'm sorry. The summit is coming up on July 9th. It's going to bring 32 NATO leaders to Washington. It's going to be judged by what the alliance does and does not do for Ukraine. They'll put in a historical context. This summit is supposed to celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary as the world's most effective military alliance, as history's most effective military alliance. And I'm scratching my head and saying, how do we celebrate NATO's 75th anniversary as the world's most effective military alliance if the alliance is having difficulty enabling Ukraine to win this war, to win on its terms, decisively and quickly? How can we have confidence in the alliance's future if the alliance is unable to do this? And I ask this because I look at the imbalance of power between the alliance and Russia. I mean, the alliance has $54 trillion in GDP. Russia, less than 2. So we're talking about a difference of 25. The alliance spends about $1.4 trillion on defense this year, is the estimate. Russia, 100, 120, less than 1/10. And of course, we know the immeasurable differences in the capabilities of allied forces and those of Russia. So how is it, and this begs the question, how is it that the alliance is unable or unwilling to give Ukraine the tools and support it needs to win this war speedily and decisively on its terms? Both General Breedlove and Ambassador Volker talked about, the lack of strategy. So when I look to the Washington summit, I see as an opportunity, I may be a little Pollyannish on this, an opportunity to roll out a strategy. And I think that strategy would have to in order to be successful, it's got to have 5 key elements. Start off with the key point that General Breedlove made. You got to have clear objectives. You got to embrace Ukraine's objectives clearly and unambiguously. And that's total territorial reconstitution. Total territorial reconstitution. Anything short of that is disillusioning to the Ukrainians. And it emboldens Putin. Second, weapons, 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 as has been emphasized by this group repeatedly. With the capabilities that's needed, the mass that's needed, the speed of delivery that's needed, and without the restrictions that impair their use. And there's no reason why Ukrainians shouldn't be able to use Western weapons, US weapons against any legitimate target anywhere in Russia. We're impeding Ukraine's ability to use our weapons effectively when we put on those restrictions. Third, economic sanctions. Look, Russia grew by 3% last year. That is testimony to the inadequacy of our sanctions regime and its enforcement. Sanctions alone won't stop this war, but it certainly can impair Putin's ability to execute it. And it's certainly a demonstration of the kind of resolve that the West should be applying in the support of Ukraine. Fourth is a truly effective communication strategy to undermine Putin's war. It's amazing to me that here we are being subjected to, that is Europe and the United States, to massive Russian disinformation campaigns. It's escalated over the last year. Why aren't we responding in kind, if not solely to focus on our support for Ukraine? Why aren't we weaponizing the truth to enable the Russian people to really understand what Putin's doing to them, to their nation? We're not doing that. And then fifth, NATO membership. I'm among those who believe a clear path to NATO membership is not just an element to secure the peace after the war, because we don't know when that war is going to end. It could never technically end. It's got to also be part of the win strategy. NATO membership and Article 5 is the only thing that Putin respects. Granting that to Ukraine, which it's earned, I would say, is the only way to convince Putin that Ukraine is no longer in a gray zone of European insecurity, vulnerable to his hegemony and his imperial ambitions. Just as an aside, I unfortunately am come to the recognition that I don't see the summit providing Ukraine an invitation. They're talking about a bridge. Bridge to where? Bridge to nowhere. So I've been trying to brainstorm and think, what are things that can be done to give, quote unquote, this bridge credibility? And the two suggestions I'd have would be, one, since the Ukrainians are on their irreversible path to NATO membership, why don't we act like that? Why don't we start institutionalizing that process? Right now, all our engagement, all the building blocks of the bridge are things in which Ukraine sits across the table. They're receiving assistance. The NATO-Ukraine Council is not a circle. It's a rectangle with NATO allies on one side and Ukraine on the other. They are kept outside of the alliance, even though they're supposed to be integrated into the alliance. Why don't we do things like integrate Ukrainian officers and civilian personnel to NATO command structures and NATO headquarters? Why don't we have NATO sit at the North Atlantic Council, just like Sweden and Finland, for that matter, Poland did when they were on the path to NATO membership? Ukrainians have an immense amount of knowledge and experience, probably unmatched when it comes down to managing and dealing with the Russian threat. They could bring to NATO deliberations, NATO planning. And people go, well, what about the risk of, leakage or security risk? I can assure you, the Ukrainians are not going to be sharing NATO secrets with Russia. There are probably some current allies that are more of a risk of doing that. And by the way, having Ukraine sit at the NAC, just as the Swedes did when they were on that irreversible path to NATO membership, what a powerful signal of inclusion, of determination to bring them in to the Ukrainians. And what a powerful signal to Putin that they are on an irreversible course to membership. In fact, they are a de facto member. But I go on too long on that. Let me just close by saying Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an inflection point for NATO. What NATO does and doesn't do in support of Ukraine will have profound consequences. First and foremost, for Ukraine, of course. But it will also have profound consequences for the alliance, because it sheds insight into whether or not the alliance still has the political will, the resolve, the resoluteness that made it so successful over the last 75 years. What NATO does and does not do in support of Ukraine are going to shape perceptions about that fortitude, about that political will in the eyes of NATO allies, of NATO's adversaries, both within Europe and well beyond.
Ian, thank you very much. And this may be a little frivolous, but I would like you to move your camera so we know that you have your senior advisors there with you.
That's where all my good wisdom comes from.
The other one is flying down. John, you are, I mean, you travel and you're in touch with people in Europe and here and in the administration and out of it all the time. You've heard a lot of thoughts and suggestions here. What are your comments to where we are here and as we approach the summit?
I'll be comparatively brief because we've heard wonderful things from all of my four of the panelists. And of course, three of them know NATO far better than I do, and the other knows military affairs and weapons far better than I do. But let me state something which has been implicit in the conversation, but not explicit. When Ian talks about NATO has to demonstrate the will, when Kurt talks about it will be good if the United States followed the example of our allies in removing all restrictions on the use of American weapons in Russia, they're not stating clearly, and I'm not faulting this, that in fact NATO has worked historically for the nearly 75 years of its existence because of strong American leadership, because of American vision. We're the ones who have always defined what the challenge is and what the alliance must do. We haven't quite seen that since Putin began his war on Ukraine, not 2 years ago, but 10 years ago. Each of our presidents have blown a very uncertain trumpet. If we're going to have a really world-class outcome to the 75th anniversary of NATO Summit in Washington in 3 weeks, it requires American vision and American leadership. And that's frankly something we have not seen. What we have seen is a policy since, well, the policy at the beginning of the war under Obama was simply feckless. Basically saying, quote unquote, Moscow has escalation dominance, which is baloney if you look at the economic numbers that Ian raised regarding our GNP and our military capacity vis-a-vis Russia's, to justify sending no military assistance. And we've seen since the big invasion a policy which I call adequate. And it is adequate because our policy has prevented a Russian victory in Ukraine. But it's a policy which has been reactive and done the minimum to make sure that there is no Russian victory. It has, in fact, been timid at defining American interests clearly so the American public understands why sending $40+ billion a year of American aid to this war, even if we pay it to our own defense contractors, is very much a smart investment in American security. Kurt made the point when he said, we have a vital interest because if Putin wins in Ukraine, he may well go west, and we may well find ourselves having to fight Moscow to protect our NATO allies, especially in the Baltic region. So NATO has been a principal reason. NATO, led by visionary and bold American leadership, has been the principal reason why there's been no great power war since we defeated the Nazis and the Japanese in 1945. So we have to make sure that Putin is not emboldened to actually toy with the NATO power. Because if he sees that our timidity, which thus far has prevented us from giving Ukraine what it needs to win, it continues, he may decide that we would not be willing to defend the Baltic states, which can be easily taken in ways that Ukraine cannot be easily taken by the Red Army. These are the stakes. The administration has not made this clear. And Kurt also pointed out that President Biden did say, yes, we want Ukraine to win in December. But he said it in a whisper, not a shout. And he never explained what America must do in order to make sure Ukraine wins. Instead, this is an administration which has become a consummate master of deflecting excuses, when in fact the only reason we have not defined clear victory and enabled clear victory is because we have been intimidated by Moscow's constant nuclear threats, something that never characterized American diplomacy since the nuclear age began over 70 years ago. That's a serious problem. That's why John Kirby says, and General Breedlove is right to be a little bit annoyed about this, that we've given Ukraine everything it needs to win. That's nonsense. And many people have called the administration on this. The Ukrainian offensive on land in 2023 had only mild success, something I predicted because we did not arm them for full success. And multiple generals and other military experts have explained the lack of a full success on land last year was a creation of the White House in combination with the Chancellery in Germany, because those have been the two principal timid partners to make sure that the West has not given Ukraine what it needs. Now that's how we need to. That's the framework for understanding the relatively meager results we will see at the upcoming NATO summit. Clear steps towards Ukraine membership at NATO will not be seen. The bridge to NATO's eventual acceptance of Ukraine as a member is going to be airy-fairy. It's not going to be concrete. Ian offered some sensible ideas about, for example, Ukraine joining the NAP, integrating Ukrainian personnel into the NATO structure. Be nice if it happens. It's not gonna. It's not gonna. There is one hope that the NATO summit will produce one valuable result. President Biden said when he met with Zelensky at the G7 that in the near future, he didn't define it, Ukraine will receive 5 Patriot batteries. They need about 7 or 8, but if they got 5 in the next 2 or 3 months, that would be a large step forward. If in fact it were possible to at least announce during the NATO summit a date certain for delivery of those batteries, that would be a clear positive outcome. Because without a doubt, while it would be wonderful to see Ukraine in NATO, the most important thing we need to do is arm Ukraine to defeat the Red Army. That includes Patriots, includes a lot more, as our group has been stating ad infinitum since the fall of 2021. But this will be a nice step forward. And if the administration is able to produce that at the summit, I will applaud it. But that's the only possible real thing that I'm expecting at that summit.
John, thank you. There's a lot here to discuss among the panelists, but there are a couple of questions that come in, and one it's sort of been dealt with, but the administration's timidity is often explained as being in fear of escalation, and escalation that could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. I think I'll go first to you, John. I mean, because we've talked about this, you've talked about, well, we've all talked about this, but I'd like your response or comment to that.
Kurt foreshadowed my answer when he said that if you're really worried about World War III, the place to avoid it is Ukraine, by making sure Putin fails in Ukraine. It's worth noting, and this is sometimes controversial, but it really should not be, that this is truly Putin's war. You go back and look at those strange videotapes that were aired just before the big invasion, and you see all of Putin's inner circle, the Siloviki, were not enthusiastic about what he was saying. So this adventure is Putin's. And if Ukraine seriously threatens Crimea, Russia's war in Ukraine begins to end, or maybe it's over as the threat becomes real. And if Putin were to win in Ukraine, he will definitely challenge us, either in Poland or in the Baltic states. And then we have to act. Then we have to shoot at Russians. And that seriously raises the increase of a war between the United States and Russia. We have seen at this point 6, 8, 10 Russian red lines saying, they will use nukes. For example, if we were to fire or allow Ukraine to fire on Crimea, if Finland or Sweden were to join the alliance, and those red lines have been passed and they have not gone nuclear. There are Russian voices. A former 3-star, retired Russian 3-star, said on Russian TV, Russia would only use nukes if in fact Moscow itself was threatened. In other words, not if Ukraine takes back occupied Ukrainian territory. So we have allowed ourselves to be intimidated when, in fact, the much greater danger is our weakness encourages Putin to cross our red line, which would be an attack on NATO soil.
Anybody else want? Deborah, like to make a comment?
Yeah, I do. I always like to delve into this, the nuclear Armageddon scenarios. First, I think part of this is because a huge number of people who have only done arms control for a living are spreading these nonsensical stories and these Armageddon scenarios that this is going to lead to nuclear war. We really have to sit down with Putin and discuss our stockpiles and blah, 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 and do more arms control. And I think they do have influence at the White House because these are people who like to wave those red flags all the time that this is the bad motivation because Russia's going to do this and we really need to draw back and draw down our nuclear stockpile. I think this is what happens when you don't have a strategic vision. And this is what happens when you allow what I call, and Kurt will chuckle at this, the functional bureaus to make decisions for what global policy should be. And I think this is not a great idea because they don't understand the regional imperatives. And they don't understand the broad strategic picture. So that's the first thing. The second thing is NATO's been threatened by Russian nuclear weapons. If you're Poland and Lithuania, you're sitting right across the border from them in Kaliningrad. They've had short-range nuclear weapon systems in Kaliningrad for decades. And so NATO, it's already sitting on NATO's border. So these threats about Belarus being added to that are kind of ridiculous when you know where these weapons have been. Third, I'm not certain at this juncture that if the Russians were to use an Iskander system and knowing on its track record on the conventional side, that it wouldn't cause them more harm than it ever would the Ukrainians or anyone else. And fourth, as we know, China, India, Pakistan, even Iran, Russia's partners, who are nuclear powers or nuclear wannabe powers, would rather Russia not do this because then it kind of renders their deterrent, which has been effective in places like Kashmir, China's deterrent, which it believes allows it to bully everyone in the Indo-Pacific region. It kind of renders it less effective because if Russia were to use something, it kind of undermines their ability to just threaten people with their weapons. And so I think if you look at this logically, it is a ridiculous argument. It's not going to stop people from pounding that drum, but it is a ridiculous argument.
Anyone else on that point? There's another question, and it's preceded with some comments, but the bottom line is something that we've all talked about has come up here. Does the United States really want Ukraine to exist? General Breedlove.
Well, I'll take first swing at it. I think that while this administration has not performed well either in this respect, neither have several before that. I do not believe U.S. leaders have explained to the U.S. public, Joe and Sally Sixpack, they have not explained why Ukraine is important and why we should not allow this to progress on multiple levels, from European security to economic impact, to standing up for those who are legitimately trying to become democratic and join a more Western orientation. Our succession of governments over the last 10 years, and this war is 10 years old, not 2.5 years old. We have done a poor job of explaining this to the American public. And sadly, I don't think it's going to get any better until the election is over. Whichever way it turns out, then maybe we can begin to help the American public understand the import of a free and whole Ukraine to the rest of the world.
Kurt, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. So I want to be a little bit more charitable and say, yes, I think the United States wants Ukraine to exist, and I think the administration wants Ukraine to exist. It's just that they are not being realistic about the threats of it not existing and the risks that we have to be willing to bear, the cost we have to be willing to bear to prevent those risks from materializing. And this is not only about Ukraine's survival, where it is at risk if Putin is allowed to win, but it's the risk of peace and security in Europe, which is something that generations of Americans have stood for and died for, and we can't just throw that away. So I do think they want Ukraine to exist, but I think they are lowballing dramatically what's at stake and what it takes to make sure that we prevail.
If I could
Ian?
add, I just say the following. I think the administration is committed to Ukraine's survival and existence. 75% of Americans want Ukraine to win. The problem is that the Biden administration's fear of conflict escalation and its support of Ukraine trumps that desire for Ukraine's security and its independent sovereignty. And it's dangerous because the longer this war continues, or even worse, if Ukraine fails and Putin wins, the risk of war and all the nuclear escalation that comes with it, a war with a NATO ally, actually significantly increases. And this is the root failure of the administration's, or the root underpinning of the administration's inadequacies in their support to Ukraine.
The first question that has come in, it goes back to President Trump. I noticed that Ian used the word "it trumps" something in your comment. Is there a way there? Obviously, the questioner has concerns about where Trump is and his understanding of Russian-Ukrainian history and so forth. I know that we have all talked about this and things have been done, but the questioner wants to know, is there a way to get to President Trump, former President Trump, and discuss this and educate him on the importance of a Ukrainian victory? John, I think I'll go to you first on that. Oh, here you are.
Okay, so please say that again.
Well, the questioner wants to know if there's a way to get to President Trump, and because he doesn't seem to have a sense of Ukraine, Russian history, the importance of Ukraine, victory, and so forth. But the idea is getting to President Trump.
I think it's important. I mean, first, I've never met the man. I know some of his advisors, although I wouldn't say I know them well. Clearly, if you're able to, well, first of all, clearly there are some people around him who understand the stakes. I believe Robert O'Brien understands the stakes very well. I think that Mike Pompeo understands the stakes also very well. That's one. Two, we know there are certain things about President Trump. For example, he sees himself as strong. He sees himself as a shrewd operator who will not be suckered by geopolitical opponents. So I think if it were possible to make the case to him that Moscow has a long record of insinuating things with opponents, with enemies, about being able to get along, and that Moscow has a long record of making promises it doesn't keep. So if you make a deal with the Russians, you better have a plan B for what you would do if they break that deal. And I phrase it this way because we've recently seen a plan come out by people who are associated with the Trump campaign, although this is not official policy of the campaign, suggesting that you have essentially a peace agreement based upon the current battle lines, and you have and the United States makes clear that anyone breaks that, they'll be held to pay. Well, as Deborah likes to point out, there's never been a successful ceasefire in place anywhere in the world without American troops. Now, I'm pretty sure that that's not what those advisors have in mind. So as Trump considers advice like that, the case needs to be made that you may well find yourself being double crossed on the terms, and you may well find yourselves in a far less advantageous position to deal with that militarily if you go down that road. And that Putin and his senior advisors have made clear that the United States is adversary number one for Russia. That's something that any president of the United States needs to understand. So arguments like this, I think, may have an impact. They certainly resonate, I think, with a large majority of Republicans, and that's something which may also have the president-elect, if he wins, may also have to bear in mind again if he does have a second term.
Thanks, John. Phil, you've talked to a number of people on the broader Trump team. What are your thoughts on this?
So without betraying confidence, I would say that they intimate that Mr. Trump does have a basic understanding of this, and that that Mr. Trump has a particular way of opening negotiations and working negotiations, and he wrote about that in his book in chapter 6, and that what you're seeing play itself out there in the larger public is the beginning of a conversation about how we move forward on Ukraine. I take those people because they were serious people and also of very senior stature. I take them at face value, and so I have to think that maybe there is some substance to that conversation. So I think we will see. My disappointment is I do not think this conversation is going to elevate as it relates to Ukraine until the election is over, because I think that both candidates right now see other issues, domestic issues, border issues, crime issues, as what this election is all about. And I don't think they're going to take risk in being big on Ukraine out there until the election is over. So I think that any serious conversation with the winning team, and should that be Trump, will probably be on the back burner until after the election. Over.
Bob, can I chime in on Phil's points there? I completely agree. And I would go so far as to say I think both campaigns do not want to talk about Ukraine right now. This is not in their interest. And they do instead want to focus on other issues, different issues. Some Republicans wanting to talk more about immigration and the economy, Democrats wanting to talk more about abortion, but neither of them really wanting to talk about Ukraine. The second point I wanted to make is about articles such as we saw from Keith Kellogg and Fred Fleitz, or the one from Robert O'Brien. First off, the plans are different. Their views are different. Secondly, none of these have any status with the Trump campaign or with President Trump himself. I view these more as audition pieces. People are hoping to be brought back into a Trump administration. And so they're writing things as an audition, not because they actually reflect anything about what President Trump might really do.
Well, and of course, he said that if he's elected, he'll have the war over before he's even inaugurated. Nobody's written how he's going to do that. Anyway, I think this has been an awfully good discussion, and we're coming to the end of the hour. What I'd like to do is I don't want to call it a lightning round because I don't want people to be any briefer than they really want to be. But we essentially are talking about the upcoming summit, what can be done, if anything, and where Ukraine is through the summit for the rest of this year. And well, why don't I use the same order that we started off with? Kurt?
Sure. We spent all our time talking about what the United States and what the West needs to do. And this is incredibly important because it is in our own interest. We're talking about how to advance America's own interests. But I think we also need to spend one word on what Ukraine needs to do. And Ukraine has become excessively centralized, everything running through the presidential administration. They are not reaching all of their people. They are losing some political support. They need to empower Ukrainians. They need to empower ministries. They need to get a whole of country effort together in order to strengthen Ukraine and take advantage of the strengths of Ukraine in defeating Russia. So I'm a little concerned that Ukraine has over-centralized and therefore is not taking full advantage of its capabilities and its promise. That is something I think we need to work with Ukraine on, give them the confidence of our support so that they can feel that they can relax some of that centralized control.
Thank you. Phil?
So once again, let me agree with Kurt. But let me take a little different tact and offer that one thing I would love to see Ukraine do is to continue doing what they are doing on the battlefield. Ukraine, fighting a world superpower, is doing very well in the grand scheme of things. There are problems, no doubt about it. And we need to look at how conscription and other things are done and possibly have the world see more skin in the game on those issues. But the bottom line is Ukraine is doing what it can do to the best of its ability on the battlefield. And Russia is throwing immense blood at this fight and losing, now we hear, as many as 1,200 a day from competent sources. This is hard to understand. And so we need to push ever harder to give Ukraine what they need to fight.
Thank you. Deborah?
Just very quickly, I would just say that going with what Kurt and the general has said, I think Ukraine needs to more increasingly define mass as not being personnel. So when it brings mass to the battle space, it needs to bring all of its excellence in high tech, in STEM, and everything else that it has. Russia's always going to define mass as how many personnel you can throw at this and not worry about the casualty numbers, as General Breedlove said. It's just not of interest to them. But when you don't have those personnel, you can't define mass in the same way. And they need to start defining mass as being critical enablers, force multipliers, that sort of thing. Not every person has to be a gun toter. Not every conscript needs to do that. There are conscripts who can do other things very well. And I think Ukraine increasingly is moving in that direction. They just have to move there more quickly.
Thank you. Ian?
Thanks, Bob, and thank you for organizing this and including me in this. Our discussion followed last night's debate between former President Trump and President Biden. So to me, it underscores we have two candidates who have both inadequate policies when it comes down to supporting Ukraine. It's really important. I know you're working on this, Bob, but it's just to the others. It's really important for our Central European coalitions and ethnic groups in the United States, particularly in swing states, to start making this more of an issue. That's the best and most effective way to start pushing both candidates in the right direction when it comes down to doing what needs to be done to enable Ukraine to win this war on its terms quickly and decisively.
Boy, I agree with that. John?
I come back to the notion that we need top-line leadership to define to the American people America's vital stakes in defeating Putin in Ukraine. We've had a lot of interaction with the Trump team. They're not prepared to do this now. That's not to say they'll do it after, if they win election, and Biden has a second term, but that's absolutely necessary. And on the Republican side, again, there are some figures there who understand this, whether there's something that they would be able to say publicly on behalf of their administration if Trump wins is a question. But it all starts with that. We had to persuade the American people that we had a stake when we created NATO. We need to demonstrate to the American people that we have a stake in defeating Putin in Ukraine. This is America's interest, not just Ukraine's.
Thank you. I want to go back just briefly and mention that I'm not sure it's going to take place. Everybody will get an announcement. I'm working on, there are a number of European leaders who are interested in a webinar early next week on the same subject as NATO. I'm not sure it's going to work out because of the conflicts. Their various parliaments are in session and so forth. But the bottom line message of what I've understood from them as we've been talking about having this webinar, they want to reach out, as John or as Ian just said, to their diaspora in the United States to speak up to this administration and say how important Ukraine winning is to them and to the security of the alliance and the world. I probably shouldn't advertise something that may or may not take place, but just the message that's coming from them to me as we're trying to see if we can get a time is very, very strong, that they want to have a voice to their diaspora, that they need to be heard. And I think everybody on this webinar, we've all experienced that members of Congress, both parties, opponents and supporters of Ukraine, have told us they hear very little from their constituents in support of Ukraine. They hear from opponents, they hear that, but people, the 75% of the American population that supports Ukraine needs to speak up. Our political leaders, they keep track of these calls. They keep track of messages. They need to know that we really want this. This is an election year. I think everybody's right. You know, it's not the Ukraine, the two candidates campaigns are not going to be wanting to emphasize Ukraine, but they ought to be hearing about it from voters. With that, unless anybody wants to say anything else, I thank our panel. I always thank you. I always learn from you. I enjoy being a part of this, and I hope our audience got something out of it. Have a good day and a great weekend.
Godspeed to Nadia.
Thank
Thanks,
you.